Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to today's InfraSight webinar, which is being recorded. And thanks for taking the time with us today. InfraSight is our webinar series where CPCS provides insight on topical areas related to transport and power infrastructure. My name is Adrian Lightstone. I'm the Vice President, Canada, CPCS. CPCS, for those who don't know us, is an infrastructure advisory firm that works to provide better plans, implementation, and deliver infrastructure projects. We specialize in matters impacting the transport and power sectors worldwide, from supporting transport decarbonization to improving public transit systems and supporting governments in their transition to clean energy, among others. Just a few housekeeping items before we dive into the presentation. First of all, please drop any comments in the questions in the chat box on the side of the screen. The more the better. We'll try to get to them all. Secondly, everybody is muted, and we'll periodically respond to questions throughout the presentation, and we'll take time to answer the questions at the end. And lastly, if you miss anything or have to leave early, please don't worry. We'll be sending out the recording shortly after to everyone who has registered. Now, about our speakers, Liz and Nick. Liz is a principal consultant and our climate change lead at CPCS. She has almost 20 years of consulting experience in the transportation and infrastructure sectors, covering freight, passenger transport, and planning, decarbonization, e-mobility, infrastructure governance, and financing. Welcome, Liz. And Nick Roberts, who is a senior consultant at CPCS and also a professional engineer. He has supported clients in Canada and overseas with their transition to more sustainable transportation options, including fleet decarbonization. Today, Liz and Nick will be speaking about the risks that climate change are posing to the public transit sector and some of the adaptation solutions that are being considered to mitigate such risks. Just a point of note here that most of the examples in the presentation today are Canadian, but are applicable to projects and transit infrastructure around the world. So over to you, Liz and Nick.
Great. Thanks, Adrian. Can you hear me okay? Great. All right. Let me move on. So Nick and I, as Adrian mentioned, are going to split the presentation. And again, welcome to everybody who can join. Thanks for coming. So I'll start with just a quick overview of what we mean when we talk about climate change resilience. We hear the term resilience often. Generally speaking, it's the ability to withstand and adapt to changing conditions and recover from these sort of shocks and stresses. If you think about resilient transport infrastructure, it needs to be able to continue to provide services, recovering from whatever shocks and stresses it may face, whether that's technical failure, extreme weather events, labor strikes, or otherwise. And when we think about climate change and resilience, there's two terms which are kind of useful to understand. The first is on the left of this slide, climate stressors, which are really the events or factors that can impact ecosystems. It's what we think about when we hear about climate change, broadly speaking. So these are, more extreme temperatures, severe storms, high winds, sea level rise. And in turn, these stressors can create risks, climate risks in future, or sort of the risk of harm from the anticipated climate stressor. So examples sort of on the right of these risks are things like floods, as a result of higher precipitation, wildfires as a result of higher temperatures, and associated threats to human health. Another concept that is useful to understand when we think about resilience and climate change is the climate stressors. When we think about how to address those climate stressors, we're talking about more about mitigation efforts. So decarbonization in the transport sector. We often talk about renewable energy, electric vehicles, hydrogen-powered vehicles, etc. And that's really thinking about how do we stop climate change? How do we slow the pace of climate change? And when we're talking about climate risks and adaptation strategies, we're really talking about how to live with climate change, how to make our infrastructure and systems more resilient so that when those risks come to bear, as it were, we can better bounce back from them to provide services. So examples of these climate stressors abound in Canada. The map here shows how Canada is warming. Well, it is warming roughly double the global average, especially in the northern and western parts of the Canada. Higher moisture, higher rainfall. This can lead to more melting of permafrost in the north, loss of snow cover, sea ice, which in turn leads to coastal erosion and storm surges, or can do. We're also seeing higher temperatures affect atmospheric energy, which can result in increased storms and lightning. The map on the right, or the graphic on the right, shows southern Ontario and the density of lightning in a single year over a 20-year period. And so you can see much higher density or frequency of lightning strikes in the sort of southwestern regions of Ontario, which in turn creates higher risks for infrastructure damage, fires, power outages, etc. Extreme heat can also contribute to dryness, which in turn increases risks of wildfires, as many of us witnessed this past summer for the first time. I'm based in Ottawa, and we certainly experienced a lot of changes to our lifestyle over a few days this past summer. And these, wildfires, they don't just affect infrastructure directly. For example, damaging a rail bed through fire or heat, but they also create poor air quality, which has impacts for people and sort of air management systems, or HVAC systems. And you can just see from the image here, this is the incidence of smoke hours from wildfires at Calgary Airport. And it's very clear that, the past decade has seen a significant change relative to the previous, 60, 70 years. So, we talk often about temperatures warming overall, particularly in Canada, but we're also seeing more extremes and cold snaps, which really test out our infrastructure as well, and sometimes our personal resilience to get out and clear the car as well. You can see here, for example, some snapshots of temperatures during a cold snap in 2019, with some temperatures in Dryden, Ontario, going down to -38. This type of temperature has a real impact on your transportation assets. And of course, as Adrian mentioned, we're talking about examples from Canada, but these extremes are happening all over the world. Just a couple examples here. Africa's getting hotter with increasingly variable precipitation. And again, in Asia, they expect us to face many risks, which are going to vary across the region, from, similar to Canada, permafrost thawing in the northern parts, but sea level rise in some other parts, particularly many of the islands in Asia, dust storms, heat waves, heat islands, and urban centers. All this to say, climate change is affecting everybody. Now, regrettably, it's not easy to make our infrastructure more resilient to climate change, although it needs to be done. In part, these stressors that we're talking about, they really vary in anticipated frequency and severity and are highly localized. What that means is it's not simply a question of saying, well, look, Canada is going to see more rainfall everywhere. It's going to go up by 1% a year for the next 5 years. These events vary in frequency and severity, and it really depends which part of the country you're in and which part of the world you're in. So every asset or every region needs to be analyzed separately with sort of a tailored solution. And of course, we're growing in size. Many of the cities globally are increasing in terms of population, which is putting additional pressure on our existing infrastructure systems to begin with. And really, one of the biggest challenges around resilience, going back to the first slide I spoke about, making your systems more resilient versus decarbonizing or trying to mitigate for climate change, is the cost involved in both, and the ability to understand and measure and be guaranteed of sort of benefits from your actions, particularly if you're thinking about governments making decisions about where to put money in terms of decarbonization versus adapting infrastructure. In the case of resilience, what you're really trying to do is assess what your future risks are going to be and and put some money up front now to address those risks, but those risks may not materialize. So essentially, you're certain to increase your costs by adapting your infrastructure now, but there's no guarantee that those risks will come to bear, and that has implications for sort of developing a business case. There's also rarely any revenues associated with making your infrastructure more resilient. Might have a huge impact down the line if you don't, but there's no certainty. So that's one of the reasons you hear often in the climate change or just global space in newspapers. There's a lot of talk about decarbonization, electric vehicles, and the like. But increasingly, people are realizing now, say people, sort of infrastructure owners and decision makers, that adaptation is more attention needs to be paid to it, adaptation going forward. I'm going to hand over to Nick now, who is going to talk a little bit about what this all means for our systems.
Great. Thank you very much, Liz. So I think Liz done an excellent job setting the context of what's happening with all these climate stressors. In this section, I'm going to talk us through how does this map to public transit systems, the different types of assets that they have, kind of stepping through one by one each of the climate stressors with some practical examples. So I think first it's important to recognize that public transit systems are quite complex. They're made up of a variety of different types of assets. So hard infrastructure assets, point-based or linear. So you have buildings like transit stations or transit bus maintenance garages, linear infrastructure like roadways and track, and then a lot of supporting electrical equipment as well. We're seeing more and more that transit systems are electrifying to decarbonize, and there's a much greater reliance on electrical systems for functioning of a transit service. But then as well, it's very important to recognize the human factor behind everything. There's a lot of dedicated workers out there on the front lines operating transit systems and maintaining them. And of course, the human side of things is definitely impacted by climate change as well, if you think to events like heat waves, which risks the health. So in the next slide we'll start talking through how intense precipitation is affecting climate change in some respects. So here there's some examples of how precipitation, both like in the spring and summer months and also in the cold winter months, may impact and disrupt transit service. The pictures there on the right is an example of a snowy day in Ottawa with the light rail train operating, and that leads to some risks of snow and ice buildup on the right-of-way. And of course, there's also a risk of freezing rain buildup on the catenary system, which is the overhead electrical wires which supply power to the train. So that's one example there of how intense precipitation can impede transit service if it's not cleared properly. And then, of course, there's a risk of kind of more flooding, localized flooding events, which without proper detection systems or drainage systems can lead to transit assets getting stranded in service. One example there is back like almost a decade now, and that's a GO train that was in the Toronto area, very low-lying floodplains near the Don River, and passengers needed to get evacuated from on board that train. And then, of course, electrical systems don't like water very much at all, and there's a lot of risk, especially for subterranean structures, of water getting in and causing damage to all kinds of electrical components that manage signaling and power for your transit service as well. So going from precipitation to heat on the next slide, we'll talk through some examples of that. One of the interesting images up there on the right is a section of buckled track. So essentially what happens is when it gets really hot, metal tends to expand and that can push against points where it's fixed. And that causes the rail ties or the track to warp, and that leads to a risk of possible train derailment. So that's concerning in hot temperatures. And then, of course, as Liz alluded to, and I think I could speak for a lot of people across Canada and probably other areas of the world that are impacted by forest fires as well, that in extreme heat conditions, you have poor air quality, which impacts like people's health of transit workers, customers taking the transit service, but then as well also stresses the load for ventilation and air conditioning systems in facilities, like in a garage, as well as on board the vehicles themselves. And then, of course, heat doesn't mix very well with electrical systems either. There is a heightened risk of increased load on the grid, which could lead to blackouts and brownouts. And if a large section of your transit vehicles are dependent on electricity, that can cause disruptions to their operation as well. So going from very hot to very cold on the next slide, I'll step through some examples that definitely are relatable in Canada and also other areas where you get cold snaps. You know, Liz had mentioned that we have global warming, so in aggregate temperatures are tending to rise, but there's still occasions where you have irregular weather patterns and cold Arctic air drifting south. And those cold snaps can lead to all kinds of issues, namely like a reduced operating range for battery electric vehicles, as well as risk of equipment seizing up in cold conditions. The picture there that looks like that the track is on fire is actually gas heaters that are using to defrost switches in Chicago so that the trains are able to switch tracks appropriately. And that's preserving the function of their transit service. And the bottom image there is an electric bus in Winnipeg. And Winnipeg is often one of the coldest cities in Canada. And that bus is charging en route while it's in service, not only when it gets back to the garage. And that was one of the mitigations that Winnipeg came up with to lengthen the operation period of their electric bus fleet. So if you're going to go to the next slide, another one of the changes that we're seeing is seasonal temperature fluctuations. So this is really like in the far north regions where there tends to be permafrost. We're seeing that permafrost is melting and causing unstable geotechnical conditions. So segments of road and track that were once built on a very stable surface are now becoming unstable, as well as in the spring flooding when the snow and ice pack tend to melt. That can lead to washout of big sections of track. That image there is at the top is from a rail line stretching into northern Manitoba in Canada. And that section of track got washed out and severed transit accessibility for a large number of rural, remote, and Indigenous communities that depend on that transit line for service. If you want to go to the next slide, the next category of climate risks is really severe winds and storms. That brings lightning, a risk of debris, obstructing guideways and damaging vehicles. Last Christmas or around the holiday period, there was an incident where a tree fell and stranded passengers on board a passenger train, and they had to be evacuated, but that was quite a challenging condition for all of the parties involved to manage. And then, of course, there's a risk of impaired visibility if you have like blowing snow conditions that can impair visibility for transit operators as well. So we go to the next slide. This example is a little bit more of a localized climate impact, but still nonetheless very impactful for those transit agencies operating in coastal conditions. We're seeing sea level rise and more severe storms coming off of the oceans, and that's risking erosion. So again, unstable conditions that road and track are built on, washing out. And then you can see the image there at the bottom right. There was actually a shore wall collapse. This is taken from a rail line in the United Kingdom, and that severed functioning along that rail line for about 2 months when it needed to get repaired. And of course, transit infrastructure in areas where there's salt water, metal and salt water doesn't really mix very well. So if you have seawater flooding, that can risk corrosion to that type of equipment as well. So that said, that summarizes the climate stressors, but there's some other trends that are interesting in the public transit space, and I'll pass it back to Liz to talk about how some of those trends are impacted by climate change. Liz, I believe you have your mic on.
Thanks. I mentioned a few minutes ago, just simple population growth and increased urbanization all over the world is in and of itself creating more pressure on our public transit systems, more demands. And sort of added to that urbanization and growth are a few other trends in the sort of public transit space. The first is related to increased push for decarbonization and electrification, which is great. It's one means to slow climate change, but it does mean there's greater linkages and risks between electrical grid failure, blackouts, brownouts, and risks to transit service. So, another consideration is a shift to electric buses relative to internal combustion engine buses, is that electric buses and the batteries in them make the bus heavier overall, which will of course have some impact on wear and tear on the road. So you need to factor those considerations in. Just to give a few examples of passenger rail projects in Canada that are intended to operate with electrification in future, including the Via High Frequency Rail project, which is under development, the GO Regional Express Rail, which is in the Greater Toronto area, and a large number of LRT projects, most of them again in the Greater Toronto area. So this sort of trend for electrification, decarbonization presents positives for climate change, but also some challenges in terms of additional considerations for resilience. Just let me go to the next slide. Another factor that's changed gradually, I'd say, over the past 20, 30 years is that the sharing of responsibility for development, financing, management, operations of public transit. The historical or traditional way of developing and operating public transit systems was entirely in the public transit, or sorry, the government's responsibility. Maybe your municipal or regional government would be responsible for designing, building, operating, and maintaining your system. That, as many of us know, has changed significantly, and there's a real push towards increased involvement from the private sector and public-private partnerships, which involve risk sharing with the private sector. And so that you really need to start understanding and thinking how you're going to plan for climate change and those risks, and who's going to bear those risks over the long term. What are the costs? What are the risk sharing arrangements that can be put in place? And what are the insurance cost implications? Governments, generally speaking, have deep pockets and can access insurance quite easily, whereas a private sector company that's looking at a 20, 30-year concession for example, the high-speed rail in California, they're going to need to look out quite far ahead. What does climate change look like for us if we're going to be on the hook for any damage and impact on services? Last but not least, it's just worth noting that there's other interfaces with public transit and climate change. Nick's already mentioned increased prevalence of wildfires, and you need public transit vehicles often to evacuate people from the wildfire area. So it's just another pressure point. Same with that during heat waves, you might need additional vehicles around to transport people to cooling centers, for example. So it's quite a complex system that we're working with. I'm going to hand back over to Nick now, who's going to walk us through, what do we do about all this?
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, there's a lot of talk about all of the kind of the concerning things that are happening with climate change, but good thing to know that there are some things that can be done. I'll take a bit of time to walk through this slide because there's quite a lot on it. This is really one of the frameworks that we've been seeing that transit agencies are using to assess risk that's driven by climate change. So the way to think about climate-related risk, it's really a product of vulnerability and criticality, which have to be evaluated for the different assets and components of transit service. So vulnerability is really made up of a couple of items. But I guess first to think about it with a practical example is if you were to think of two different buses, a diesel bus and an electric bus, the electric bus is much more vulnerable to grid disruptions than the diesel bus would be for its operation. So that's an example. Exposure is really like how close is the asset to the hazard. So you can imagine if you had a rail line like that one back in the UK that I showed the image of, that's quite exposed to coastal erosion as a risk as well. Sensitivity, again, you can think of, it's like, what are the materials in that the asset is made out of, and how is that sensitive to the climate risk? So if you can imagine, a wooden structure is quite sensitive to a wildfire, rather than like pavement, asphalt, something made out of concrete be less sensitive to fire risk. And then adaptive capacity is how easily can that asset or system change in response to the risk. A way to think about this is routing of transit vehicles. If you had a section of flood on right of way, it's much easier to reroute a bus around a flooded area than it is to reroute a train, because a train is really fixated to running on the track. And then the next element of this is criticality. So that's really like, how important is that asset to your delivery of transit service? The example here is comparing a bus and a rail line. For a bus, it's less critical than a rail line, because if you can think, like, a lot of transit agencies operate with spare ratios, which are extra buses that are held in reserve in case some are out for maintenance or for damage. So in that respect, it's a lot easier to replace a bus that may have got damaged by a weather event, rather than a rail line, which there's a lot of trains or rolling stock assets are dependent on the condition of that rail line for operations. So that's really how you can think about risk. And it's important that, you go through this exercise of mapping out risks, identifying where you're exposed, so that can help prioritize the actions that you take. If you want to go to the next slide. If you change over to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about how some other factors are leading to heightened or new risks in transit systems. There's really kind of two things that are playing into this. One is that, as Liz had mentioned, the transit systems themselves are changing, with a lot of effort for decarbonization, a lot of new electric vehicles, but then also other technologies such as hydrogen is coming into the mix for looking at decarbonization efforts. That all leads to different risk profiles. And then as well, there's lots of sections and assets in our transit systems that are aging. And as they get older, they are maybe not necessarily designed or built in the best way for the current conditions of the environment that they have to operate in. So we have, one hand, the transit systems are changing, and on the other hand, the environment is changing as well. And that is really leading into different types of risk profiles. So if you switch to the next slide, we'll start talking about what can actually be done to improve resilience. There's three categories. We'll go through them one by one. And really, it's hardening or protecting infrastructure, relocating assets, and then the last one is changing to operations and maintenance practices. So this one, talking about hardening and protecting infrastructure, that's really using different materials or different design methods to build out stronger infrastructure in anticipation that they'll need to handle worse environmental conditions. And the protection aspect is really looking at using like sensors, kind of smart technologies to detect a hazard before it becomes more problematic. And that forewarning allows you to take action before it becomes a worse impact to transit service. So the image is there. The top one I thought was quite interesting. This is a LiDAR sensor. So it essentially shoots a laser beam across the track and is used to detect disruptions. So this is an area that's prone to rockfall and landslides. So the LiDAR sensors are being used to detect if there's any rockfall across the track. And then, of course, maintenance and repair efforts can be made rather than finding out of this the hard way. And then the bottom image there is some culverts being installed. So what we've been seeing is a lot of cities and municipalities are revisiting the design standards for their drainage systems, trying to make them more robust for handling, say, like what may have been once a 1 in 100 year scale flooding event to something that's like 1 in 50 years type of event now. So it's bigger, it can handle more flooding type of activity. And then another example, track laying temperatures, thought this was interesting. Metrolinx had revised the temperature that they install new track at, and that is going back to mitigate against that risk of buckling, where you have that image of the squiggly rail track. So install it at hotter conditions, it's less prone to that happening. In the next slide, we'll talk through relocation of assets. So this is not necessarily the most easiest of the adaptation measures, but there are ways that you can elevate sections of like right-of-way, roadways, track, and low-lying flood areas, for example, or reroute sections from areas that are prone to coastal erosion. And then maybe a more simple case is that if you have electrical equipment that's exposed to a lot of heat, just simply isolating that, moving it to a more cooler area and shaded conditions can help reduce the thermal stresses on those systems. That image there on the right is actually work that Amtrak had been doing in their climate vulnerability assessment to map out areas that are prone to flooding risk. This is in New York. So I think the idea is step one, you identify where these areas are, and then they can go through and assess what assets do they have in these areas, and is there anything that they can do to kind of shore up protection or relocating them for sea level rise. And then in the last category, I'm going to go to the next slide. This is really operation and maintenance adjustments. So on that picture there is a big snowblower truck, maybe similar to what you use to clear snow from your driveway in the wintertime. But that's being used actually, that's in Edmonton, to clear snow out of the track that the light rail train operates on. So that just to say, like, there's a motivation for looking at how frequently and the types of maintenance efforts you're doing to make transit systems run smoothly under these newer kind of environmental risks and conditions. And then the other image is a picture of a backup power generation, which can be used to provide some contingency for electric transit vehicles that may need to still provide critical transit service in the cases of a blackout. There's also all kinds of other things you can do, like de-icing spray that's used to prevent ice buildup on electrical wires and things like that. So those are kind of more kind of physical things that can be done for adaptation. If you go to the next slide, Liz had previously mentioned that all these actions come at a cost. And with the acknowledgement that, you know, a lot of construction contracts and that are typically done, well, they meet the technical requirements, and then a lot of it's based on price. But to build more resilient infrastructure, that comes at an increased price. So I thought one interesting case to talk through here is really how to tie in resiliency to contracting methods, incentivizing the owners of these infrastructure assets and transit systems to spend money to kind of shore up the resiliency of their operations. And this chart is a chart of weather-related delays on the Network Rail, which is all of the rail assets in the UK. And they have an operating track access agreement. So basically, freight railways and passenger railways have a contract with Network Rail to operate on their track. And if there are weather-related delays, Network Rail has to pay out basically payments to them to compensate for like delays related to wind if there's down debris obstructing the track and the users can't use that section of the track, or if there's flooding and that needed to get treated before service can resume. So I thought that this was an interesting way to kind of incentivize a contracting mechanism, like payments and financial performance of an entity is being directly tied in to how resilient it is against all of these climate-related disruptions. So that said, I thought that that was an interesting example, and I'll pass it back to Liz to kind of close out with some more key thoughts on how we can look at advancing our climate resiliency.
Thanks, Nick. This is our last slide and really just a summary of the key challenges and points, some of which we raised already. As mentioned just a second ago by Nick, increased resilience, really, it comes at a cost, but with unpredictable benefits. And what this makes extra challenging is it's really hard to communicate a business case for spending that, whether it's capital upfront or changing the way you do operations to avoid future disruptions, for risks that may or may not materialize. There's also from the work we've done in this space a lack of a standard methodology to evaluate the costs and benefits of these climate-related impacts and risks. What that means is as you're developing a new transit system or sort of upgrading, renewing your existing transit system, you have a wide range of experts involved, city planners, city engineers, maybe owners engineers, consultants, construction companies, operating companies, and they will all have varying degrees of experience about how you can plan that asset to be climate resilient. And they may have, be taking different standards for different parts of the world, or in some cases relying on, typically from what we've seen, historical climate science. How often has there been flooding in the past X number of years? Okay, we'll plan for a flood based on that historical data. And we now have obviously far better data and predictions about what climate change will look like in future and the impacts that what that could mean. But it doesn't mean that knowledge is well known or embedded across some of those stakeholders that I just mentioned. Going back a little bit to the procurement point, traditionally operations and construction and maintenance contracts, when you're picking a contractor, there's quite a heavy weighting on price. And if the resiliency considerations are not very clearly embedded and sort of required or outlined in your proposal documentation, it could be that those risks are not factored into pricing. So it's just another consideration that adds a little bit of a layer of challenge that needs to be thought about when you're going into a procurement. And then, of course, the last 2 points are really around the resources that are available. Generally speaking, public transit is globally very heavily subsidized to varying degrees. It's not a revenue generating business in most cases, and public support is often required, particularly for capital and often for operating. So transit agencies, generally speaking, face financial shortfalls to make these added investments, which is why doing this risk assessment and doing it well is so critical, so they can identify what's high risk, medium risk, low risk, and make difficult decisions about how to spend their relatively limited financial resources. And then last but not least, as you might expect, what we've seen is that the larger transit agencies have some more financial levers to pull, as it were, and they also have more personnel and resources available to do this work and do the research and understand what it means for their systems relative to smaller transit agencies. So there's bound to be kind of an ongoing learning curve in Canada and around the world as we learn from the sort of leaders that are working this space, and it trickles down into becoming sort of standard practice, as it were. That is my last slide. And as you know, we've recorded this webinar, so you can see all of this information when we'll share the link after. But perhaps at this stage, I will stop sharing my screen and look forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you, Liz and Nick. It was a very informative presentation. And I think, personally, after a year like the last year, where there's been a lot of signs of climate change and how we start to think about our assets, it's very topical, both for existing assets and also for how we think about. We have a couple of questions in the chat, but I'm just going to start off with another one here, and then I'll move over to the chat questions. Given the risks that you've mentioned, what do you think is preventing transit owners and operators from making their systems more resilient right now?
I can chime in. It relates a little bit to the point I was making just a couple minutes ago. It's a combination, I think, of understanding and knowledge. These are kind of new areas for many in terms of understanding the climate science and climate data, and being able to look forward in terms of what is going to change in your environment. That's really a completely new area that may not have been looked at in the same way before. So it's a set of data and skills that probably don't exist in many transit agencies. Just carrying out that risk assessment, that wouldn't be done. And bearing in mind, if you think of a typical city, when we're talking about public transit, they need to do a risk assessment for all of their assets. They're not just focused on transit. They're thinking about hospitals, roads for general, personal vehicles, trucks, hospitals, all the other assets. And that's what we have seen, at least in Canada, is that the kind of larger cities, what typically happens is that there'll be a broader climate change risk framework for the whole city. And then the larger cities that have larger transit agencies are now drilling down and doing an assessment for the transit and transport sector specifically. But so really I think it's a question of resources and finances and time and capacity, which, it's getting better. But I'd say that's the biggest delay or biggest challenge, as it were.
Okay, very good. Nick, anything to add there?
No, I'm completely in agreement with Liz. I think she summed it up very well. I think like transit agencies, like there's so much human resources, like time in the day and capital available. And I think a lot of them had been focusing on trying to recover ridership emerging from the COVID pandemic. And I think fortunately we're seeing a return to transit in the most part, which is good. And of course, having more ridership means have more capital available, and then that can, potentially be used for, climate adaptation. But the other thing too is like a lot of funding that's available is largely targeted towards decarbonization, like mitigation efforts, as Liz mentioned. So a lot of like for electric buses, charging stations, and things like that, and maybe a bit less so for some of the non-flashy type of things like installing larger culverts or things like that. So,
Very interesting. Okay, let's take a couple questions from the floor here, and for everyone that's still on, please get your creative questions going. So the first one is, are there any mandatory standards to address resilience of different types of infrastructure?
From my understanding, the short answer is not really. There are some standards at the ISO level about, how to carry out resilience assessments or how to develop a resilience plan, broadly speaking, or for infrastructure. It's not transport specific per se. I think standards are being developed, and Nick may have be more close to this, but I think some standards have been developed with respect to climate resilience and energy systems and electricity systems, including in Canada. But when it comes to transit and transportation systems, those standards don't yet exist. There is work being done across the country, a number of working groups, and I'm going to get some of them wrong. I know some of the standards associations are looking at this, including CSA group, the Canadian Standards Association group, is looking at where there are gaps in standards that could maybe be updated, specifically in transport, specifically with climate resilience. The National Research Council has a working group working with multiple levels of government and transit agencies at that sort of conversation stage. What are the issues? What are you finding? How are you doing things? So work is happening, but there are, as far as I know, maybe others on the call can correct me if I'm wrong, but there are no specific standards for transit to follow. And it's very difficult to set those standards because every system is very different. But
yeah.
Nick, you have more to
I
add.
agree, and I would agree. And just to add to that, like there are some, say, regulations we've seen, like more from like, in Canada as an example. Transport Canada is a federal like safety regulator. Like they have authority in some respects of that, and what we've seen, there's a couple of things, we say semi-related to climate adaptation. When they have like a wildfire risk mitigation for railways, which sets out standards on like how far back brush needs to be cleared away from the track, and other requirements on like reducing sparks coming out of the locomotive exhaust, which is all related to mitigating the risk of wildfires and drought areas and things like that. And then they also have a cold weather operations plan, which is really for, I think is a little bit more for freight railways, but the idea is that in really cold operating conditions, when you have these intense cold snaps, the rail can become more brittle. And as a result of that, sometimes there's a need for reducing the speeds of travel for the freight trains. But then, of course, in Canada, and I'm not sure the case elsewhere, but a lot of the rail infrastructure is shared. I mean, the freight railways own it and then provide access a lot of times for passenger rail to function. So if you're slowing down freight operations or impacting those, they also do have an impact on passenger operations as well.
Interesting. So it sounds like there may be some asset-specific standards, but it's still kind of a growing body of knowledge as to how the standards would look across many asset classes.
Yes.
Is there emerging evidence from the insurance industry on future costs, i.e. are the premiums increasing substantially or companies refusing coverage?
You know, what I hear here is anecdotal, and yes, on both counts, especially the premiums increasing substantially. I don't have any specific kind of details, though. To be honest, it's still so new that both sides of the coin are trying very hard to figure out what would be reasonable risk for an insurance company to take on across the board. So no, I don't have sort of specific stats or data to qualify that. I don't know if either maybe Adrian or Nick has any experience in that area.
I would just say too, like, I'm not as well versed in the insurance sector, I must say, but I know that there's some cases in like other sectors, such as like for home insurance, that in some cases there's like just they're not insuring like homes that are built in areas that are prone to like wildfires. And then similarly, you might see like in coastal areas as well, that if you're building out new infrastructure in an area that's prone to sea level rise and erosion, that could really prohibit like what kind of options, like design options or routing options, are available in the future.
Mhm. You know, one other thought that is probably worth noting here is that there has been a much higher increase in reporting on all elements related to environmental, social, governance from corporates across the world. And as part of that whole reporting process, whether it's TCFD or Global Reporting Initiative, identifying the climate specific risks for your company, a lot of that information is now more reported, it's more collected, it's more reported on, and it's publicly available. So that is probably providing a better base of information from which to make decisions about insurance risks and what companies may or may not be willing to cover.
But I
I
think
know there's work
Yeah.
that's being done at the University of Waterloo that relates to climate change, climate adaptation and insurance, partly sponsored by Intact, the insurer. How that has related to actual premiums or changes, I'm not entirely sure, but it is a growing, I guess, body of research. Another question from the participants. Any thoughts on public-private partnerships, CDPQ Infra and Montreal's REM, for example, for risk mitigation? So I guess the question is relating to the procurement of a new infrastructure. How is maybe risk of climate change and climate adaptation built into the P3 model?
Mm-hmm. I just saw the chat and it says public partnerships. I'm not very familiar with that this precise model or the funding model for the REM, but if it is indeed public or kind of quasi-public and private, it's probably providing an indication of how that the private sector is not willing to take on some of those risks, and or insurance companies backing the private companies are not willing to take those risks, and so the public sector is having to step up and take on more of those risks. Yeah, see, public partnerships. Yeah, pension fund. That's, I guess, why I call it semi-public. So it's an illustration really of how the market presumably is not willing to take on some of those risks. And I mean, broadly speaking, in transit, not just climate, there's been a shift. It's all public and like, oh, hey, let's get the private sector to do absolutely everything. And the UK rail industry is a perfect example of this, where it wavers back and forth about what is the right balance of responsibility generally for capital and operations. What should lie with the public sector? What should lie with the private sector? And I think this example, bringing it back to this climate change presentation, is, I think it's tilting some aspects back towards the public sector. And maybe 5, 10, 20 years, we'll all have a much better sense of what those climate risks are, and the insurance industry will, and contractors will, and we'll lean back with more risk to the private sector because we'll have models to follow and experiences to be based on. But yeah, that the REM example is probably a good one, shifting a little bit more public.
I would say one trend that we're seeing in the Toronto area with respect to procurement of major transit projects is a shift towards progressive contracting methods, where the proponent will enter into a development phase with the owner, and over the course of a defined period of time, a year, 2 years, 3 years, work towards kind of a more of a target price contract, where you're reflecting refinements in design and potentially how to include and mitigate climate adaptation. So I'd be curious to know whether climate change is kind of included in those, thought of in those progressive target price type contracts, but I don't know the answer myself. Any other questions? One more came in here. Are there other notable examples of well-integrated resilience in transit infrastructure?
Go ahead, Nick.
We wanted, well, I think there's a lot of examples we can say, but I would suggest one of the studies or climate vulnerability assessments that we reviewed as part of this work is LA Metro, the one in Los Angeles, had done a very good job actually of breaking out what are all of their climate risks, what assets they impact, and what are some of the actions that they've been taking to mitigate against those. So if you're interested, I could get your contact after the session. I could forward you a copy of that report that LA has. It's publicly available, but I thought that that was a very good example of a transit agency doing an assessment of this type. I think one just interesting example that they're doing, I don't know if this is the most profound example, but in California it gets hot, and for their light rail trains, a lot of the overhead wires tend to sag in the hot conditions, and what they have built in is a tensioning mechanism. So essentially these things torque up and tighten the electrical wires when it's hot, and that mitigates against that heat risk impacting their transit service. But there's a number more like that in that report, so I'd say I'm happy to share that one.
Okay, very good.
One other example closer to home in Ottawa, where I live, is that you can see as they're building out more bus shelters, for example, many of those are covered now, and that could be protecting you from certainly rain and heat, and it's an added cost, but that would be an example of a relatively small resilient impact to prevent impacts on individuals, travelers, from heat waves, for example, just to try and keep you that much cooler while you're waiting for the bus, and to increase ridership, so that they're there and they're to protect you from the heat, as it were.
One more cool example I had is I was in Edmonton couple weeks back for the Canadian Urban Transit Conference. And big thanks to the city there for hosting us. And as part of that, I did a technical tour of their garage, Kathleen Andrews Garage, which is where they've got their fleet of 50 electric buses there. But one of the neat things that they had for climate resilience is they have a recycled rainwater system. So rather than having hardscape everywhere on the grounds of where the transit garage is located, they actually have like a permeable surface which the rainwater can go through and gets into a recycling system for the building. And that gray water is being used for the bus wash. So it's good because you're mitigating hardscape surface, so you're not having as much area prone to flooding. And it's energy efficient because you're recycling this water that comes down for using it. And what's a big part of your transit service, washing the buses every day.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Okay. Thank you to everyone for attending. If there are no other questions, big thanks to Liz and Nick as the presenters. If you have any questions about the webinar, feel free to contact communications@cpcs.ca. Liz, did you have your contact on the last slide, or?
Yeah, I can pull it up right now.
Just put that up again for a sec.
There you go.
Yeah. So any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to answer them. And look out for future InfraSight sessions. It's an ongoing webinar series that we will be providing. And so look out for future notifications in future. And thanks to everyone for attending. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.